First thing, as those who are looking in on this fourth segment of the series this evening, taking a walk through the Bible, walking through the Bible, we're going to hit over these next several weeks most of the major stories that are in the Bible and discuss and meditate upon what their meanings are to not only those that they wrote these stories to, but also what it means to us and what it is calling us to be and to do. We welcome everybody who is watching online this evening. We hope and we pray that you will participate where you are, whenever you are watching this, and know that this word is a living word, one that you don't have to be here today. You could see this 10 years from now, or 20 years from now, or 50 years from now, and still be relevant, with the exception of probably my clothes, because by that time they'll all be out of style. But beyond that, let's talk a little bit about Exodus 3 and why that's so important. First off, some rules of the interpretation of verse 3. One of my good friends sitting over here on my right, June, always wants me to make sure that I'm clear about some of the words in there and what they really mean. Well, if you go back to, let's go back to verse 1, where we first understand that God is seen in the life of his people as a God that is above the mountain tops. Mount Horeb was thought of as a place that if you want to go interact with God, you go on up Mount Horeb, and it's high enough where that the climb and the effort to get there, that would also eventually lead you above the cloud line, you would literally be in the face or the presence of God. It was thought of as being a holy place, holy meaning separated unto God. And so at the end of verse 1, when they talk about being they came to Horeb, the mountain of God. This was a place of God. They recognized that it was not like every other place. It had special meaning. In verse 2, it said, the angel of the Lord appeared to him, meaning Moses. And who is the angel of the Lord? First off, angel here simply means messenger. It means you received, God was nice enough to you to give you a message from him that you could not excuse away or misunderstand as being from any other source other than God. And so whatever this source was, whatever this messenger who gave this divine revelation to Moses, it came to him in the form of a flame from the midst of a bush. Now, I don't want to go much farther than the flame in the midst of the bush, because I think you'll find this most interesting, is that first, it is not an unknown secret that the vast majority of all flame or fire references in the Bible, both Old and New Testament, Brenda, they're actually referring to the power and the presence of God. So if you see something about flame or fire, they ain't really talking about, something's going to burn you. They're talking about that the actual presence of God was palpable. You could feel it, you could see it, you could sense it, and you were not going to deny it, because nothing about it was the same as any other fire that you would cook your meat on or boil your water with. It's not the same. There's something about it that is profoundly different, that when you see it, when you experience it, you know it's not of human origin. The flame. Now, where was this flame? This flame was in the midst of a bush. I want you to notice here, this bush has no description whatsoever. It's just a plain old bush on the side of Mount Horeb. Now here's the thing. Some people I've heard explain this away by saying this divine revelation, the fire, the actual presence and reality of God, was sitting in an ordinary item. I don't think so, because it just said the verse before that this was on Mount Horeb, which was the mountain of God. And anything placed in a place which is separated for holiness or unto God's work, even if it is the most ordinary thing to us, becomes holy. By merely associating with that of God, it becomes holy. Now, why is that important? Because later on in this lesson, and I'm letting you know what one of the major themes is here, is that if indeed we place ourselves in the presence of God, as ordinary creatures as we are, I mean, look at Lowell. You could not get more ordinary than him. God bless his heart. Okay? But if Lowell stood right in the middle of something that was dedicated to God, and he knew that he was standing right there in the middle of God, and he intentionally went there to be right there in the presence of God, then God then can literally ignite him into be something profoundly holy. You don't have to go to Rome to be holy. You don't have to go to the big cathedral in downtown Knoxville, St. Louis, Detroit, Los Angeles, New York. Wherever God is understood as being, you become the bush. And the flame or the reality or the palpable presence of God then burns within that which is associated with God's holiness. You understand what I'm saying with that? So, in this mountain of Horeb, where Moses was walking around, he saw this bush, this thing that was set aside on God's holiness with a flame burning in it. The symbolism is that on God's mountain, his presence was obvious. It was felt. With verse 4, so when the Lord saw that he turned aside to look, God called him from the midst of the bush and said to Moses, "Here I am." His curiosity, Moses got the better of him, and yet his humility knew that he was in the presence of the actual essence of God. He wanted to look. He shouldn't look. He couldn't help looking. You know, it's kind of like you're driving down the highway and there's an accident and it's really not very pleasant, and you know you probably ought to mind your own business, and you don't want to kind of look because you don't want anybody to think you're nosy because you might see something gory, and you know you shouldn't, but what do? You look anyway, because it's something that's drawing you. It's something outrageously unusual. Does that mean you don't know that there are accidents that happen every day? Of course you do. But there's something about our nature that when it's extraordinary, we want to look at it. We want to see it, but we want to see it from a distance. And Moses, I am positive that as he's standing on the side of Mount Horeb, looking at this ordinary object, this bush that was set aside for God's purpose, with the flame or the presence of God standing in the middle of it, even though he knew that he should be humble in front of its sight, and even though he turned toward it, there's no way in the world that I would think that he ran up to it. Who in their right mind would see a bush that don't go away with a hot flame and you're going to run up and see if it's real? I mean, no idiot would do that. None. Moses may have been a lot of things, but an idiot he was not. But he turned and he looked at this bush, and the bush, in effect, the flame that was inside this bush. I want you to get this now. This is the most important symbolism of the entire chapter 3. Moses looked at what the rest of the world would have thought was ordinary, Lowell. And inside the ordinary, because it was in the place where God was, it became extraordinary. And the extraordinary, God defines it, we don't. Now, why is that important? We're going to get to Moses and what God said to him in a minute, but I wanted you to get the reality of what this big message is right here in the beginning of chapter 3. If you have the skill to speak eloquently and to wax poetically and to be a wordsmith, people would say you ought to be a preacher. The fact of the matter is, throughout the Bible, those who did not speak well were the ones that God chose. If you were thought to be a weak person with a lack of defining character that the rest of the world would assume would be what God would want to use, God would choose you over Mr. Priss or Miss whatever. That's why when I look at some of the pastoral epistles, Timothy and Titus, where it talks about what you ought to be, they don't ring very true to me at all. Because the vast majority of the rest of the Bible, in Timothy and Titus says you've got to be this, you can't be this, you've got to be a person of good report, and you have to be, nobody's got to think bad of you. Well, the rest of the Bible says just the opposite about who God claims and who God calls. Moses had a speech impediment. David was an adulterer. Ezekiel was goofy. Jeremiah was impatient. Abraham was a liar. These are not great character traits. And yet, that's who God chose. Some old woman in the middle of the temple, the prophetess, the preacher girl, Anna, preacher lady. She stuck around so she could see the first person who proclaimed who and what Jesus was an old woman. The first person Jesus told outside of the inner circle was the Samaritan woman that everybody else hated at the well. In a place where women were not thought very well of, Philip's daughters, all four of them were preachers. So God continually picks people that the rest of the world would at best would think would be ordinary, and at worst think are not qualified. Well, right before verse 5, the end of verse 4, God calls him and says, Moses, Moses, trying to get his attention, quit staring at the bush, brother. I'm here. Moses. And only when Moses answers God does God take the next step, which is this. I want you to take off your sandals off your feet, for the place you stand is holy ground. Now, why is that important? Anything. Sandals back then maybe had this big of leather on the bottom. Okay? It was to protect your feet. It's stony ground back there. You cut yourself all up doing that. There was a practical reason to have sandals on. There was a good reason. But even that much, God says there's too much between you and this holy place. So you take off, you remove anything which is getting between you and me. I'm glad that I've got your attention. See the flame in the middle of the bush. I'm glad you recognize I'm in it. Now you've said you were on my mountain. You've now heard my voice, meaning that he said, here I am, Lord. Well, now that I've gotten your attention and you recognize I'm here, I want you to remove everything and anything about you, June, Matt, Kim, that is getting in the way between you and me. And so, was it really important? Now, look, I've seen some of my friends, Brenda, they'll actually take their shoes off in the pulpit because they're trying to be holier than what, I don't know, I guess some shoe store. The point of this was not to take off your shoes, just like Revelation, it was all, symbolism for something else. The shoes represent the last thing between you and God, you being actual in connection with God. Now, Brenda, Kim, come over here for a second. Come here, hurry up. Now, people on camera, you're not going to see the rest of Kim, but you're going to see her hand. Okay, give me that hand. Come on over here. This is Kim's hand. Read that hand. This is the hat. See, real person. Okay. All right. Now, if I were going to say to Kim, hold your hand out, but do not take mine. I'm really, really glad to see you. And if you walked up to somebody and come a little closer to me, and you kind of did that, right? And I'm really glad to see you. Would they think very much of you? They think you're really stupid, right? Because that's not the custom. And have you ever shaken somebody's hand? I'll shake my hand. And it's like you're shaking a dead person because they refuse to squeeze your hand. I don't understand that. It's like somebody just forgot to finish the fish. It's limp, it falls off, whatever. But if you get somebody who is doing this, and how about they do this? I'm so glad to see you. There's a physical connection. Thank you, Kim. There's a physical connection that God required on Mount Horeb. And if there's anything, even a little half-inch of leather, whatever it is you're holding back, you got to get rid of it to really be in connection with me. If you will, the flame inside that bush drew them into something that they, under normal circumstances, would have never experienced. You see where I'm going with that? And so it is when you are in the presence of God and you recognize the flame of God, it can be quiet, it can be loud, it can be overwhelming, it could bring tears, it could bring shouts, it could just require movement, it could require prayer, it could require testimony, it could require a decision to go do something. But there's always a reaction of some sort to the presence of God. And Moses here was in this process of reacting to the presence of God. And so God is reminding him, look, this is all the stuff I've done for you. You are leading these people. And I want you to remind them where you're leading them not to, but where you've led them from.